Have you ever wondered what it feels like to watch someone you love dismantle their own life, brick by brick, right in front of your eyes? Most people would scream, cry, or throw things. They would let their emotions dictate their actions. They would make a scene, beg for answers, and eventually lose their dignity in the process. But I am not most people. I am a man who deals in facts, figures, and cold, hard reality. The scene was set for a classic tragedy, but it felt more like a business meeting. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. I sat in my Eames chair, the leather cool against my back, sipping a glass of 18-year-old scotch. It was perfect. Sarah stood near the limestone fireplace, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She was shivering, though the house was perfectly climate-controlled. On the coffee table between us, a thick manila folder rested, its edges crisp and unbent. That folder contained the end of our marriage, but Sarah didn't know that yet. She only knew that something was wrong. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my tone low, even and detached. I looked at her, watching the panic flicker in her eyes like a dying light bulb. I asked her if she really thought the water usage logs wouldn't spike, or if she simply assumed that because I paid for the house, I wasn't paying attention to the utility meters. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The confusion was genuine. She thought she had been careful. She thought she was safe. I slid a single page of paper toward her. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a divorce filing. It was a technical log, documenting the surge in energy and water usage in the guest house. Her face went completely white. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely final. People often ask me why I am the way I am, why I don't react with anger or passion. The answer is simple. I am a forensic auditor. For the last 15 years, I have built a career on finding discrepancies. I don't look at people, I look at patterns. My job is to find the anomaly in the data set, the crack in the foundation that everyone else missed, and the lie buried under layers of professional-looking documentation. I have spent my life recovering millions in corporate fraud, untangling complex money laundering schemes, and proving that while human beings might be complicated, their actions are almost always predictable. I was trained to see the world as a series of transactions. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that everyone leaves a data trail. Whether it is a digital signature, a timestamp on a server, or a sudden change in spending habits, people leave crumbs everywhere they go. They think they are being clever, but they are just being human. I have seen CEOs with massive egos make the same stupid, avoidable mistakes as a teenager stealing from a register. It is all the same to me. I don't get angry at the fraudster. I just admire the complexity of their failure. When I married Sarah, I applied that same philosophy to my personal life, though perhaps with a bit more optimism than I should have. Our marriage was built on a model of mutual respect and clear boundaries. We didn't have a traditional, messy, emotional relationship. We had a professional partnership. I provided the security, the infrastructure, and the lifestyle, and she provided the social management, the networking, and the warmth that I admittedly lacked. It was a cold equation, but it balanced. It made sense. We were partners in the business of living. I thought the variables were stable. I thought that because I provided everything she could ever want, the risk of betrayal was statistically improbable. I was wrong, of course. I treated my marriage like a corporate asset, assuming that as long as I managed the risks and maintained the infrastructure, the project would succeed. I didn't account for the fact that people don't want security. They want excitement, and excitement is usually found in the places where it doesn't belong. I didn't set out to catch her. I wasn't looking for a betrayal. I was just living my life. doing my work, and trusting the systems I had put in place. I believed in the structure I had built. But as I sat there in that room, looking at the woman I had built a life with, I realized that I had made the most fundamental error of my career. I had trusted the human element. I had forgotten that no matter how much you pay, how much you provide, or how much you secure the perimeter, people will always find a way to burn it all down just to feel something for 5 minutes. That is the professional background of the man she married, and that is exactly why she never stood a chance. She didn't realize that she wasn't just hiding a lover in the guest house. She was hiding a liability in the house of a man who makes his living by liquidating liabilities. I watched her hand tremble as she reached for the paper, and I knew, with absolute mathematical certainty, that her life as she knew it was over. Not because I was angry, and not because I wanted revenge. It was over because the numbers simply didn't add up anymore. And in my world, that is the only thing that matters. The unraveling of my marriage didn't happen in a single, dramatic moment. It didn't happen because of a sudden discovery or a whispered rumor. It happened because Sarah, like most people who commit fraud, eventually became arrogant. She started her interior design startup in the early spring, and at first, it seemed like a perfectly reasonable endeavor. She claimed she needed the guest house, a structure I had purchased and renovated as a tax-advantaged asset years prior, to function as a dedicated creative studio. She spoke about focus, about the need for total privacy, and about creating a space where her genius could flourish without the mundane interruptions of a bustling main house. I, being the supportive partner who prioritized asset utility, agreed immediately. It made sense to utilize the property. It was a logical allocation of resources. The transition, however, was subtle. At first, it was just long hours. She would head out to the guest house around 10 in the morning and return for dinner. Then, the timeline shifted. She started staying later, claiming she was meeting with suppliers or finalizing layouts. Then, the privacy became a hard wall. The guest house had always been an open space, but suddenly, the deadbolt was always engaged. She began mentioning Zoom meetings that required absolute silence. When I walked toward the building to drop off coffee or just to check on the HVAC settings, she would intercept me on the patio, her body language stiff, her smile forced. She acted as if I was an intruder in my own home, a nuisance disrupting her professional flow. I didn't argue. I didn't demand to be let in. I simply walked away, adjusted my tie, and went back to my study. I didn't need to see what was happening inside to know that something was wrong. You see, when you spend your life analyzing data, you stop believing in coincidences. I began to notice the small, persistent anomalies that didn't fit the narrative she was constructing. It started with the utility portal. I have a dashboard on my phone that tracks everything from power consumption to water usage for every square foot of the property. It is a feature I use for tax optimization, but it also serves as a perfect surveillance tool for anyone who knows how to read it. The water bill for the guest house spiked by 40% in a single 2-week period. That is not the water usage of a woman working on interior design layouts. That is the water usage of another person living there. People are remarkably careless with their digital footprints. They assume that if they aren't being watched by eyes, they aren't being watched at all. She didn't realize that the guest house was connected to the main server and that the smart home system logs every interaction. I checked the HomeKit data one night while I was lying in bed. It showed that the smart lock was being disengaged at 2 a.m. and locked again at 7 a.m. It was happening every single night. Then, there were the physical clues. I have a habit of checking the recycling bins. It is a mundane task, one I do to ensure our waste management is efficient. I found receipts in the trash that were crumpled up, yet still legible. They weren't for office supplies or fabric swatches. They were for high-end espresso pods, gourmet craft beer, and imported snacks, things that Sarah notoriously hated and never bought. She was hosting someone. She was feeding someone. And she was doing it in a building that I owned, on land that I paid for, using a security system that sent notifications directly to my encrypted device. The most fascinating part of this phase wasn't the discovery itself. It was watching her attempt to maintain the charade. During dinner, she would talk about the team or the contractor she was working with. She would invent struggles about supply chains and client demands. She would look me in the eye, perfectly calm, and spin a narrative that was structurally sound but factually bankrupt. I would nod, smile, and ask follow-up questions, watching her carefully construct the lies. It was almost impressive, in a cynical sort of way. She was so convinced of her own intelligence that she couldn't see the absurdity of her position. I spent those weeks in a state of quiet observation. I could have confronted her on day one. I could have ended it the moment the water usage anomaly appeared on my screen. But that isn't how you manage a high-risk situation. If you reveal your hand too early, you lose your leverage. You give the opponent time to adjust, to hide their assets, to craft a defense. I let it play out. I let her continue the charade. I let her believe that she was the smartest person in the room, that she had successfully bypassed the security systems of a man who makes his living catching people who think they are smarter than everyone else. I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel angry. I felt an odd, detached curiosity about how far this would go. What was the end game? Was it just an affair, or was there more to it? I started digging deeper into the digital trails, cross-referencing the times she left the house with the times the guest house was accessed. I wasn't looking for a lover. I was looking for a breach. And the more I looked, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. It wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. It was a breach of the structural integrity of my life. She wasn't just playing games with my trust. She was playing games with my livelihood. And that, I knew, was a mistake she would eventually regret. I just needed to be patient, to keep my cool, and to wait for the data to tell me the full story. I stopped thinking like a husband the moment I confirmed the water usage logs. From that point forward, I wasn't just living in a house. I was managing a risk profile. Most people, when they suspect infidelity, start acting on emotion. They check phones, they eavesdrop, they follow cars, and they make mistakes. They let their fear drive their decisions. I did the exact opposite. I treated my own home like an office. I treated my marriage like a corporate asset that was failing, and I began an audit. The guest house was owned through a separate LLC, a structure I had set up years ago for tax sheltering. This wasn't just a building, it was an entity. Because it was a business asset, it had a different level of security. I had installed high-definition cameras around the external perimeter of the structure. I had never bothered to check the footage before, because there was no reason to. But now, it was a data source waiting to be mined. I sat in my study late at night, the only light coming from the glow of my dual-monitor setup. I didn't feel betrayal, and I didn't feel hurt. I felt the focus of a professional who had finally found the flaw in the balance sheet. I pulled up the archives from the last month. I didn't need to watch hours of tape. I fast-forwarded to the timestamps I had gathered from the smart lock logs. It was incredibly simple. I watched a man walk into my guest house every night at 11 p.m. and leave every morning at 6:30 a.m. I paused the frame and zoomed in. I didn't need a facial recognition software to know who he was. I recognized his walk. I recognized the brand of his jacket. It was a man I had fired 3 months ago, a contractor I had hired to renovate the main house's basement. We had let him go for what I thought was simple incompetence. There were billing discrepancies, small charges for materials that never arrived, and labor hours that didn't match the progress on site. I had fired him, paid him his severance, and told him to never return to the property. He had seemed like a typical lazy worker who didn't understand the level of detail I required. But seeing him now, walking into my guest house with a key that Sarah must have given him, I realized I had misjudged the situation entirely. This wasn't a lazy contractor. He was a thief. I started pulling up the old files from his contract. I compared his invoices from 3 months ago with the current date. The pattern was glaringly obvious. The discrepancies I had caught back then weren't mistakes. They were tests. He had been probing my accounting system, seeing what he could get away with. And now, he had moved on to a more direct target. Sarah wasn't just having an affair, she was being used. It was so transparent that it almost made me laugh. She thought she was the one in control, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes of her little interior design startup, but she was merely a tool in his larger plan. I began to cross-reference the times they were together with the activity on my personal investment accounts. It was chillingly methodical. They weren't just wasting time, they were funneling money. I tracked a series of small, automated transfers that were designed to look like routine subscription services and utility payments. They were skimming off the top of my accounts, moving money into a dummy corporation that I quickly traced back to the contractor's address. It was amateur hour. They were leaving a digital trail so wide a child could follow it. I sat there for hours, watching the numbers shift on my screen, watching the narrative of my marriage collapse into a cold, hard spreadsheet of criminal activity. Every dollar they took, every minute they spent in that guest house, every lie Sarah told me at the dinner table, it all turned into evidence. I didn't feel the need to rush. I didn't need to kick down the door. In fact, I wanted them to keep doing it. I wanted the amount stolen to reach a threshold that would guarantee a felony conviction. I wanted the evidence to be so overwhelming that there would be no room for excuses or plea deals. The arrogance of the situation was the most interesting part. They were stealing from me under my own roof. They were using my own infrastructure to dismantle my assets. They were so convinced that I was just a blind, distant husband that they never stopped to wonder why I never bothered them. They interpreted my silence as indifference. They thought I was too distracted by my work to notice the theft, too detached to care about the affair. They didn't understand that for a man who lives in the world of forensic auditing, silence is the most dangerous sound you can hear. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my scotch. I had all the proof I needed. I had the video footage of his entry and exit. I had the digital audit trail of the fraudulent transfers, and I had the records of the dummy corporation. I had enough to end them both. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to witness the peak of their confidence before I pulled the rug out from under them. I closed the laptop, feeling a strange sense of clarity. The audit was complete, and the results were conclusive. It was time to start planning the resolution. I decided that the confrontation would happen during our anniversary dinner. It was the perfect stage. It provided the cover of a celebration, a social occasion where people are expected to be polite, restrained, and composed. I invited them both to the main house. I told Sarah that we should celebrate the milestone of her new business venture alongside our anniversary. She was hesitant, of course, but the arrogance that had been growing in her for months made her reckless. She thought she was untouchable. She thought I was oblivious. She accepted the invitation, and she brought him along as her consultant. It was almost funny. They walked through the front door of my house, smiling, dressed for dinner, completely unaware that they were walking into a room where their entire reality was about to be liquidated. I poured the wine, a vintage I had been saving for a special occasion, and set the table with the precision of a surgeon. The mood was sophisticated and calm. We talked about trivial things, the market, the weather, the design project she was supposedly managing. I watched them interact, exchanging quick glances that they thought were secret. It was fascinating to see how they mirrored each other, the way he would nod when she spoke, and the way she would look at him for validation. They were so busy acting the part of the successful power couple that they didn't notice I wasn't eating. I was just watching. I was taking notes in my head, logging the behavior, waiting for the exact moment the clock hit the mark I had set. The transition from host to auditor was seamless. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I simply stopped mid-sentence, took a sip of my wine, and placed the glass down on the coaster with a soft, distinct click. I reached under the table and pulled out the thick, leather-bound binder I had prepared. I didn't throw it at them. I didn't slam it down. I placed it in the center of the table, turning it so it faced them. I told them that as part of my end-of-year review, I had been auditing the company's infrastructure, and I had come across some inconsistencies that required immediate clarification. Sarah's smile didn't disappear instantly. It sort of froze on her face, like a mask that had been painted on. The man, my former contractor, stopped chewing. He looked at the binder, then at me, his eyes narrowing. He tried to project confidence. He leaned back in his chair, putting on that familiar, dismissive expression that guys like him always use when they think they can intimidate someone with status. He asked me what this was about, his tone dripping with fake confusion. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on Sarah. I told her that I wasn't tracking her heart, and I wasn't tracking her love life. I was tracking my assets. I opened the binder to the first page. It was a summary of the illegal transfers they had made over the last 3 months, mapped out in a clean, professional timeline. I explained the mechanics of the transfers, the routing numbers they had used, and the dummy corporation that linked directly back to his bank account. I didn't use emotional language. I used terms like breach of contract, embezzlement, and fiduciary negligence. I explained how the system I owned, the one they were using for their little hideaway, had recorded every single interaction, every digital signature, and every move they made. The color drained from his face first. He looked like he wanted to jump up and argue, to shout, or to bolt for the door. But the sheer weight of the data sitting on the table seemed to hold him down. It's hard to fight when you are looking at proof of your own incompetence. Sarah, however, started to cry. It was a pathetic small sound. She started rambling, trying to make excuses, talking about how it was a misunderstanding, how she was just borrowing the funds to jumpstart her dream. She was trying to frame it as a mistake, a lapse in judgment. She looked at me, desperate for me to be the husband she thought she could manipulate, not the man who was currently holding her professional and personal destruction in his hands. I didn't let her speak for long. I turned the page to the video stills. There they were, captured in perfect, high-resolution clarity, walking into the guest house at 2 a.m. I told them that the police report was already drafted and waiting for my signature. I told them that the documentation was prepared for a full-scale corporate lawsuit. I looked at the man and told him that he wasn't just a lover, he was a liability that I had identified, analyzed, and was now prepared to excise. His arrogance had completely vanished. He looked small, sweating, his jaw tight. He knew that this wasn't a domestic fight he could win. This was a legal execution, and I was holding the weapon. The silence that followed was absolute. They were trapped, not by my anger, but by the cold, undeniable facts of their own greed. The aftermath was not a storm. It was a cleanup. In my world, when an asset becomes a liability, you don't hold on to it out of sentiment. You liquidate it. I didn't raise my voice when the man, the former contractor, tried one last pathetic attempt at a bluff. He stood up, knocking his chair back, and started making vague threats about my reputation, about how he could make my life uncomfortable. I didn't even blink. I simply picked up my phone and tapped the screen, showing him a live feed of the local police precinct's portal. I told him that the documents in the binder were already being uploaded to the district attorney's office and that he had exactly 10 minutes to leave the state before the charges were officially filed. He looked at me, and for the first time, he really saw me. He saw that I wasn't just a husband who had been cheated on. He saw a man who had already accounted for every possible variable, including his pathetic attempt at retaliation. He realized that his life was about to be dismantled, not by a fist, but by a paper trail he couldn't delete. He left without his coat. He left without a word. He just walked out the door, knowing that if he ever showed his face near me or my property again, the only place he would be staying would be a prison cell. He was a small man who had bet his life on a scheme he didn't understand, and he had lost everything in the span of a single dinner. Then there was Sarah. She didn't leave immediately. She sat there, the tears finally drying, looking around the living room as if she were seeing it for the first time. She tried to tell me that she was sorry, that she had made a mistake, that she still loved me. It was almost laughable. The love she was talking about was just another variable in her failing equation. I didn't get angry. I didn't tell her she was a traitor. I simply slid the prenuptial agreement toward her. It was a document I had drafted years ago with the foresight of a man who knows that even the strongest structures have structural weak points. It included a specific clause for breach of conduct that rendered her claims to our shared assets null and void the moment a betrayal was proven. She didn't argue. She knew that there was no argument to be made. I had the logs, the bank transfers, the security footage, and the legal documentation. She was out of the house by the next morning. It wasn't a scene. No clothes were thrown from the balcony, and no dishes were broken. She packed her bags in silence, with me standing in the doorway, watching the process like a property manager conducting a final inspection. When she walked out the door, the silence that returned to the house was not empty. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a system that had finally been purged of its errors. People often ask me if I regret it. They ask if I miss the life I had, or if I wish I had intervened sooner. The truth is, I don't feel anything. I don't regret the marriage, and I don't regret the end of it. It was a transaction. I provided the resources, she provided the companionship, and when the value of that companionship plummeted due to her own choices, I closed the account. That is how the world works. If you are surprised when people betray you, you haven't been paying attention to the data. You have been projecting your own ideals onto them, hoping they will act in a way that suits your narrative. Most people think betrayal is about feelings. They think it's about broken promises or hurt hearts. It isn't. Betrayal is a calculation. It is when someone decides that the risk of losing you is less than the perceived gain of what they are stealing. They weigh the options, they do the math, and they decide that you are expendable. My mistake wasn't that I trusted her. My mistake was that I underestimated her need for chaos. I thought she was a partner, when in reality, she was just a transient occupant in my life. I sit here now, in the same chair, with the same scotch, in the same house. The guest house is empty, the servers are quiet, and the audit is complete. I have returned to my work, to the cold, predictable world of numbers, where everything has a place, and every action has a consequence. Life is much easier when you stop expecting people to be loyal and start expecting them to be human. They will always show you who they are, given enough time and the right set of circumstances. You don't need to hunt for revenge. You don't need to chase them down or make them pay. You just need to sit back, keep your observations sharp, and let the consequences of their own choices destroy them. That is the only justice that truly lasts. And honestly, It's the only justice that makes sense.